Roger, welcome to the Bitcoin Infinity Show.
Knut, thanks so much for inviting me. I love the show. I've been watching some of your recent episodes. Saw the episode with Francis and Madex, both Canadian Bitcoiners. So yeah, much love and love to be on here.
Yes, so Roger, you're a fellow Bitcoin author. We always love having those on. And you're also a fellow Canadian, even though I'm not a Canadian. But this is Roger's book, Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? And so before we get into that, I'd like to have a little bit of background on you for those of our listeners who don't know who you are or why you wrote this book. So can you give us the TLDR on Roger Huang?
Yeah, no, for sure. So I was born in China, but moved fairly early to North America. But I would go kind of like back and forth between China and Canada. And it was kind of like a very unique upbringing now, I realize, because I was kind of in between both worlds a little bit. And so I was really plugged into kind of different communities, whether that's diaspora communities or just communities like within China and things like that. So I never quite lost my Chinese roots, but then I also really had to acclimate to, a new culture in Canada. I started getting interested in Bitcoin, I think in like 2012 or 2013. So some of you had Francis on, and he was much more involved than I was on this, but they had this like old Bitcoin embassy in Montreal. That was a thing. And I realized after the fact that I actually met Adam Back because he came over to our, there's like a co-working startup house called Knotman House. And one day I come in and there's all these people like putting aluminum on the walls and like, who the hell are these people? Like there's like scanning for bugs and stuff like that. And then, someone told me it was like the Blockstream team. And I was like, the Blockstream team? Like, what is that? And like one of the original co-founders of Blockstream is this guy who ran like a ISP out of Montreal. So, Montreal actually had some pretty, that's where I grew up. And Montreal had some pretty good Bitcoin kind of bona fides. And I started writing about it in 2014. That was kind of Bitcoin for me. And I've just been looking to, I think you had mentioned something about when you write, you were writing all these books and you were writing all these articles anyways, and you just decided to put them in a book. And I feel like my progression is like very similar in that. I basically was putting together these articles. So I was trying to just understand why I was so fascinated by it, and then it got to the point where I was just writing about it. 2018, I think I started with Forbes, and they gave me like a really broad latitude. And using the Forbes name, I was able to interview a whole bunch of people. And and then I wrote the book, Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? I started writing that in 2022, I think. And I was doing some research for it. I went to Hong Kong actually during the protests and things like that to research for the book and also just to see what was happening with the protests and things like that. So that's the TLDR, maybe a little bit too much TLDR, but that is the TLDR.
Oh, fantastic. Would it be appropriate to say you were ping-ponging between the two countries?
Yeah, no, of course. And I'm pretty good at ping pong actually. So I hope we can do this live, but I was playing during adopting Bitcoin in El Salvador. They had like they have like the perfect setup for me. They had a little ping pong table and they had a poker table right next to each other. So I would switch back and forth.
Oh, fantastic. So as I hold, would Mao hold? Like the obvious question is, would Mao hold Bitcoin? Do you have a yes or no answer to this?
I'm going to hit you with like a roundabout. What's funny? I gave Jack Dorsey a copy of the book and he was like, that was his first, everyone's first question. He's like, well, would Mao hold Bitcoin? I'm like, well, I guess that's kind of like my fault for choosing that as a title. Originally, so to give you a little bit of context, just to back up a little bit, originally the book was called One Country, Two Blockchains, which no one would have understood. No one would have understood. And also had the word blockchain, which I actually hate. And so to be fair to the Bitcoin magazine team, they had a really good decision. They were like, hey, like you should probably change the title. And I was like, okay, well, here's like a couple of ideas. And they really like the Would Mao Hold Bitcoin. I think in hindsight, I might have actually chosen Would She Hold Bitcoin because that's actually much more relevant. But there is some cool things about Mao being on the cover, which is namely that Mao is actually on all the paper bills in the Chinese state, right? So if you look at the yuan, it's Mao's face. Also, super cypherpunk, at least in my opinion, defacing Mao's face is kind of a crime. in China. So my book is, I don't think, allowed. Yeah, I've had that comment several times. Like people have been like trying to read it in the mainland, and they will not bring it across the border. It's like a little bit too obvious. Like the Chinese censors, yeah, it's got, well, because it's got him with the laser eyes, and
Yeah, I
I
just
also
saw the laser
pixelated
eyes.
Mao's
Yeah.
face, which is kind of like it was kind of like a cheeky little reference. But anyways, so the actual question itself, would Mao hold Bitcoin? I don't really actually address it that much in the book, but thinking through it, I mean, obviously, the one thing I was trying to go with the title to really get across was how much China has changed and still remained the same in some ways. Like how the party has always had the power. It's just replacing the figureheads, but the figureheads actually do have some substantive differences with each other. So unlike Mao, Xi reigns over a China that is in position now, that has some level of markets per se, although under the complete control of the party, right, in many ways. And so, you know, the question, would Xi hold Bitcoin, is much more ambiguous. And would Mao hold Bitcoin is a little bit more like harkening back to the old times where, you know, killed a lot of landlords, killed millions of people. There was famine and everything related to that. There's also an interesting kind of thing where I think Mao would hold Bitcoin when he was a rebel. People forget that he was fighting the caves for a very long time against the nationalist government. And one thing I do cover in the book is that part of the reason why the nationalist government lost was because of inflation. I have this presentation where, you know, there's this girl holding the equivalent of 10 USD in Chinese currency at the time when the nationalists ruled. And that 10 USD was worth like, I think it was like 444,000 of the Chinese monetary unit at the time. And so that helped Mao. And one of the first things he did, kind of strange for a communist, or maybe not, maybe this aligns perfectly, is he actually created the People's Bank of China. That was actually one of the first things he did, was he unified all the regional kind of central banks into the People's Bank of China that we know today. And that prints currency under his kind of face as well. So would Mao hold Bitcoin? The answer I usually give is yes as a rebel, no as a bloodthirsty dictator.
Yeah, that clears things up. I think it also depends on when in Bitcoin's, not only in Mao's personal history, but when in Bitcoin's history. Like the likelihood that he would hold Bitcoin if he was allowed alive in the year 2100, for instance, is way higher than if he was alive in 2015.
I mean, some other people have given me some pretty interesting answers to that, which shout out to people like other than me for thinking about this much more deeply. But yeah, like, you know, I think there's this idea of like, some of this is like Xi's dilemma, right? Like Bitcoin is like a part of, and it's this weird intersect between like state power and also like freedom technology right now at this point, right? With what's happening in the States and everything like that. So you almost have China is still holding some amount of Bitcoin, by the way, from the seizures they had of Plus token. We'll get into that maybe a little bit later. But now you see that Bitcoin has like kind of gone into the game of global geopolitics to a certain extent. And so I certainly don't think Mao could have ignored Bitcoin even now. And I never mind Bitcoin in 2100 at the point where, like, you know, I think a lot of current fiat currencies today may not exist, right? And then Bitcoin still persists. So certainly not a force to be ignored.
No, okay. So I want you to educate me a bit about how total the total control in China actually is. Because I've heard different voices describing China from the inside. And one view I've heard quite a bit is that if you're small enough of an entrepreneur, so if you're selling like fruit on the street or something, then the government leaves you alone. It's when you're above a certain threshold, they come and instantly like take over, and it's state run from then on, basically. So what's your view on that? Can you give me like the one-on-one on the Chinese economy and how totalitarian it actually is?
Yeah, no, happy to. I think first, like, I have to admit, like, so I visited China and I would go quite frequently, right? But I've never worked for a Chinese company. So I've always worked remotely for American or Canadian companies, even when I was in China. So I don't like have as much, you know, direct interface with like government restrictions. I've never tried to run a company in China. I know a lot of people who do, and I have like their stories and stuff like that, but just something to keep in mind as I'm going into this perspective, because everyone's perspective will kind of be a little bit different because the Chinese state is very multifaceted and different people have different experiences. In general, what I've seen is that if you're, there is a level, I think this would surprise people. There is a level of, I would say, like badassery to a certain extent among like Chinese people that you would think would be surprising. Like, just to give you a quick example, like there's tons of different videos of like shop owners when the cops come in. The shop owners are like, "Get the fuck out of my store! Like, what are you doing here?" So, like, there isn't as clean of a story as like, "Oh my God, we live in a totally Orwellian society. The police has all power over everyone." Like, you can quite easily see video clips of like small shop owners, right? Like coming, like berating cops, like telling them to leave and like all this other stuff. And it's like, there's a little bit of like a rule breaking, like rebel spirit among, I think, some entrepreneurs. But I will say that at the upper levels, or like if you're trying to do any serious level of business, it usually has to go through the party. And that means any number of things. It means like, dinners, which are effectively kind of, in my opinion, bribes, right? Where you are, like one of the most valuable companies in China by market cap, still might be the same one, are the producers of Mao Tai, which are sort of like this, like, it's like this white wine alcohol. It smells like tire gas. It's like 88% alcohol content or something. I don't know. Like one of the favorite things I've seen people do is like Chinese people will try to trick foreigners into thinking it's water. And then they drink like a few and then they're gone. But it's also kind of like an informal index for bribery or corruption, because they're kind of like the favorite gift to give. You have these like extravagant bottles that are worth like tens of thousands of, yuan, and like, I guess tens of thousands of like USD or euro, if we're thinking about it with other currencies. So like, yeah, like when you have a successful business, you're either, part of the party. There's about 100, about like 10%, I think, of Chinese people are in the party itself. And you kind of have to be when you're like at a certain tier, right? Like if you're trying to run like a pretty sophisticated, like if you're running like a mom and pop shop, honestly, the restrictions on you are not necessarily that strict as we've described. I mean, there still are, don't get me wrong. If you do something that kind of makes people like that punches above your weight. So like, for example, I've been reading a lot about how recently like China has been cracking down on influencers per se, like people who run small businesses, but they might have large social media followings, and, they get kicked out of their social media followings and banned because they've been talking about topics that the Chinese state doesn't want. Like the Chinese state kind of wants this very clean and positive internet. And what's been really funny to me is seeing how that vision is propagating into like the quote unquote Western internet, like through Douyin and TikTok, and how everything is basically just like a short video that sells people stuff. Like that is actually kind of the Chinese internet, but this is another topic. But, once you get to a large enough level, like you're a Jack Ma or Ma Yun or any number of like these tech titans, like you do have to work with the Chinese state. The Chinese state will destroy you if you go against it. We did see, Jack Ma, and we've seen titans like get kidnapped from Hong Kong and come to China and things like that. So certainly the party keeps a really strict hold, not only through kind of what I just described, which is like, in order to build a business, you probably need to have people in the party endorse kind of what you're doing and support what you're doing and provide you with government contracts and government financing, but also through like at the very highest levels, like if you accumulate enough economic power, you become a target and you can become, destroyed. So that's kind of what happened with Jack Ma. That's like a famous example, right? Like he gave a speech and he basically said, I think that the loan sectors for small businesses in China are totally broken. It was actually like a fairly benign, statement, and then he disappeared for like a few months, right? And recently he seems to have been rehabilitated. Like he's shown up with meetings with Xi and stuff like that. This also happened actually to the founder of TikTok. The founder of Douyin, which then acquired TikTok, who founded ByteDance. He had to apologize to the party because one of the apps he created actually had too much free-spirited discussion of politics and stuff like that. So hopefully that paints like kind of an accurate picture. I'm trying to convey that, like, at smaller levels, it's like, you have some Chinese based people that people don't really know about. But as soon as you get any significant amount of power, the Chinese party state can step in.
Yeah, so if there's one positive about totalitarianism, it is that it's not sustainable. Socialism and communism are sort of self-defeating in a way, because the economic system doesn't allow for growth the same way a capitalist system would. So, having said that, like, how much of China, how big is the Chinese economy really? Like, how much of a bubble is it? Like, how fragile is it? You see these what they call Evergrande, and all of that stuff. The housing bubble. It seems like enormous, and that it's just a house of cards ready to go at any point. Is that true, or do you think China is like a real superpower? How much of it is like blowfish economics?
Yeah. No, I mean, well, so I kind of want to approach it. There's the Chinese economy is kind of like an elephant, and we're all feeling different parts of it, right? And maybe perhaps even the party itself does not know the whole elephant. Where I kind of approach the elephant is, my thesis is that China's economic growth during the 80s and 90s was very real. But I don't think it was because of what the party thinks it is. The party thinks it's because, they try to underemphasize this, but basically what happened was, when Mao died, Mao's economic policies were like totally very coordinated, state coordinated. They were like very Marxist-Leninist, and led to disaster, right? Like, so for example, he told people to build pig iron in their backyards. He told people to kill the sparrows, and that led to famine, and that led to, like, misappropriation of resources, and, millions died. Possibly, you can make an argument that Mao killed the most people in human history, potentially, right? So certainly the China after that is different in the sense of, like, they reluctantly embraced markets. And so one of the first things that started happening in the 1980s is you had the beginnings of private enterprise. So at the beginning with Mao, you could not actually start a private company, and you could not have private profit. But after Deng Xiaoping and kind of his economic advisors came in after Mao's death, that actually became the change. This is called the reform and opening up period, which I do cover in some of the book, actually in the first chapter. And I think during that phase, to me, what it was is that the Chinese people, so like long suffering under like bad economics and things like that, they did have, I want to be very clear that I think Mao was a bloodthirsty tyrant, but one thing he did do was he implemented a unified language, and the education system was like relatively okay. So like literacy rates were up. He did this thing where he simplified Mandarin. To this day, that's the distinction that kind of persists. And so it's kind of like, the reason why I bring this up is there's a lot of interesting debates between why India and China have grown like at different rates. And one reason that's been cited is because India has like so many languages in all the different places, right? And in China, there was kind of this baseline of like a unified language that was kind of simplified, and like you were able to easily like write it out and type it. Traditional Mandarin, very beautiful, by the way. I have a deep appreciation for it. Like, actually, someone in my family was like a calligrapher. And if you've ever seen like the ink and everything like that, that's like the beauty of traditional Mandarin Chinese. But, simplified makes it a lot easier, removes all these like different strokes. It's a lot less poetic, but it's a lot easier to read, and it's a lot easier to understand. And there was like more literacy. And so there was that kind of that foundation that was growing. And then Deng Xiaoping allowed private enterprise. So you have like this like population that was growing. There was about 7 children per woman in like the 1960s. And, they were all looking for opportunity. And then Deng Xiaoping goes and says, it's glorious to get rich. It doesn't matter if it's a black cat or a white cat, as long as it hunts mice well, it's a good cat. And so people started getting the groove of like, oh, we can become entrepreneurs. And you have all these crazy stories in China. Like you have like, everyone is the king of something, or the queen of something. Like there's the trash queen and there's the paper king, the paperclip king. You think like these are very small things, right? But China has so many people that like being the trash queen or whatever is like a multi-million dollar business, multi-billion dollar business, you know? Like if you're producing a very small widget, but you're producing it for 1 billion people, like that is a very profitable business in of itself. So I think the 80s and 90s were really like the unleashing of kind of like the Chinese people. They became like entrepreneurs. And one thing I'll say is, you know, I talk quite a bit with Chinese entrepreneurs and they still have that like hard-nosed kind of mentality. They're building businesses and stuff like that. And in Bitcoin, I mean, you know, we can go into it, but you see some of the results of that, right? Like, I mean, we all talk about how like Bitmain is a centralizing force, but it's also kind of impressive that they like built this like business out of like basically nothing. And they were also like, the Chinese government was like kind of against Bitmain from the very beginning, right? So anyways, but there's also some links between, but we can talk about that a little bit more. But the point I'm trying to make here is that that part feels real. I think ever since Xi has come to power, it's become more and more bubble-like, in my opinion. And they kind of do this game where I've heard anecdotes where Xi is like, hey, why are there not more unicorns being built today to like a group of VCs? And people are like, well, who should tell them? Because he's also playing this game of like, hey, like markets are bad. And like, you know, real estate should be for the common person, should be for living and not for speculation. Okay, but now Evergrande is failing because it's a real estate developer and you've suddenly made clear that like it can't benefit from the loan financing. And that has a lot of dramatic consequences for, you know, the Chinese economy. So then now what they're doing is because of the tariffs and everything like that, Xi is sitting down and he's sitting down with all these industry titans. And now they've come up with a plan to increase consumption. So now it's like, well, let's, you know, markets are good. And also like everything he said about speculation, like we're going to rein that in a little bit. Right. So that's kind of like the tension of the party today. I do think that government stats are at best directionally correct. And they censor people. They've arrested economists who like question figures and things like that. So, you know, again, who knows really. I do think that growth has slowed down, and I think growth will continue to be quite stagnant, that the China that we see now is going to be very different from the China of the 80s and 90s and 2000s, where, you know, that was where the majority of Chinese economic growth really happened. And I think part of that is because Xi Jinping is kind of, unlike previous leaders, really trying to eat his cake right now and trying to remember, like, it's almost this whole thing where there's a lot of interesting podcast interviews with like early party figures where they're like reluctantly embracing markets. And they see it as kind of like a weapon to consolidate the party's rule, but it's a double-edged sword because they're fundamentally, the party is kind of like, the ideology of the party is against markets to a certain degree, right?
Yeah, this is so funny because like it reminds me a lot of what I've read about the Soviet Union. Like when the last days of Stalin, for instance, when no doctor dared to tell him that something was wrong because like no one is incentivized to be the bearer of bad news in that kind of society, which incentivizes everyone to be a liar. Same thing with the Chernobyl accident. It's just basically a chain of people not addressing the problem because they have no incentive to do so because they will be punished. Like, and it's horrible. Like. And of course, it isn't sustainable. So, in your mind, what would it take for China to, like, end, like the Soviet Union did in a way, like for the CCP to just disintegrate and go away, like and the firewall is torn down, like with you know, what's his name, the guy who played on the Berlin Wall when that fell, David Hasselhoff.
David Hasselhoff played at the Berlin Wall?
David Hasselhoff had a concert on the Berlin Wall with a blinking jacket. It was glorious. Anyway, so is that even possible within our lifetimes? What do you see? Like, can Bitcoin, like, can the Chinese people start using Bitcoin and just get around all of this? Is this even possible? Is there a second revolution coming?
Yeah, this is like a really vast question. I, you know, I want to start by, okay, so I'll kind of break down a few things. So I'll actually continue from the previous discussion. So
Sure.
when we talk about like the Chinese economy being like a bubble, one thing China does have going for it right now at this point is that it is the manufacturing superpower in the world. Like that is unquestionable. And whether the Chinese state is going to, they also produce the most electricity in the world, et cetera. So whether the Chinese state is going to use that for war or use that for, you know, consolidating their economic advantage, that's certainly something they have. And one thing I would point out, because I think right now there's this big like tariff war, and the idea is like, well, we want to bring those manufacturing jobs back to the West. But actually, China is the most advanced country in using robotics. And so really, if you look at the figures, the United States is vastly underusing robotics and China is vastly overusing. Basically what's happening. So there are actually entire factories in China. They call them like one person factories. It was one person managing the whole thing, and it produces about like one phone a second or something.
Yeah, I heard somewhere that the cost of an iPhone is $10, the production cost.
Yeah. It's crazy how, you know, Foxconn and that has come at a lot of human costs. I don't want to, you know, Foxconn had a lot of worker suicides and things like that. So I do want to acknowledge that.
Oh yeah. But what Apple pays to the factory, I mean, like that's their production cost.
And also Apple has made, I actually wrote this specifically in the book because I wanted to make that point. Apple has made a deal with the devil because they, because Foxconn, and they also censor apps on behalf of the Chinese government, which is a big no-no in my books. But yeah, so the Chinese economy has that advantage going for it. Like, and I think if it goes to war, that will be a very unique advantage because, for example, a lot of people have talked about it, like shipbuilding and stuff like that. So drones are all manufactured in China through DJI. A lot of like hardware and software components are at this point are made in China. So that is an advantage the Chinese state has. And this gives it a unique power and position in geopolitics. Now, I'm going to say two things that will kind of broaden our perspective here. The first is when I'm asked this question, I always tell people like, I'm kind of the same way with Bitcoin. I know directionally it's going to go up. I wouldn't qualify to specify exactly when it will happen or what will happen when. So that is kind of like my take. And I guess like China, there's been a lot of books written by people like Jordan Chang and stuff like that, where they're like, this is the year the Chinese Communist Party fails, right? And if you track it, it's like 2012, 2015, 2018, 2022, like it just keeps on, the date keeps on changing, right? So I'm not one of those people. And so I'll give kind of like a bull case and a bear case kind of for the party. So the bull case of the party is actually, I've been reading a lot about Iran. And if you think about it, Iran, the modern iteration of Iran is pretty similar age to Deng Xiaoping's China. Like they both kind of in the late 70s, actually 1979, kind of emerged. And Iran has a lot of reasons as a state that I think make it very, very weak. Like it doesn't have control over its own manufacturing capability. It has multiple sanctions. It has many enemies, many capable enemies in the region, right? It has tried to, participate in wars across different frontiers. It has been unsuccessful to a certain degree. And you would think that based off of that and the treatment of, Iranian women and all this and everything, that the Iranian government might fall anytime soon. But it's still persisted. And so there's a little bit of a like, generally, I think that for your generation, sorry, I know from your podcast that you're a little bit older, that, I think that's when you all saw like the fall of the Soviet Union. So it was like all those dictatorships were coming down at once. And since then, I don't think we've really seen, like movement in that way. Like I haven't. Actually, what happened in Syria is like kind of a really big exception to that rule, I think.
Yeah. Well, there was the Congo, but no one covered that in the West.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's been other governments too, and like there's been other like Sudan has split into two and all this other stuff. But
yeah. Anyway, No, but I still remember when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union just didn't exist anymore from one day to the other. It was like I was young at the time, of course, in my like preteens or early teens, and it was just bizarre because we grew up in the Cold War and we're told that this is the way things are, and like Sweden advertised itself as being neutral and like in cheering for the West or the East, because there were a lot of socialist propaganda in Sweden as well. So we were sort of taught that this is the way things are, and we'll just have to wait and see which system becomes the dominant one in the world. And then all of a sudden, one of the powers just disappeared, and it turns out it was way worse than anyone had ever imagined, especially journalists.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, I just think that we live in a different era now, where if you have expectations like that from before, like you saw the fall of so many different communist dictatorships, and then, you live in our era where, change of government is very gradual. So, China is so much stronger than Iran. So, I see there being some natural inertia, or like we used to think that time was on our side in the sense of like liberty and democracy and freedom, right? Like the idea was China would embrace capitalism to a certain degree in markets, and therefore its people would inevitably kind of, revolt. And I almost turn that around now. It's like the inertia of state control has actually helped precipitate that. But now, having said that and all that, a little gloom and doomy, I will say one thing. China is the epitome of gradually then suddenly.
Yes.
And so this is actually also what makes it really difficult to predict what will happen. Because, for example, one of the things I criticize Marx the most for, Marx is quite racist. I think people forget that. But he actually, I'm fine with having that highlighted in short or something.
He was very, very racist.
Anti-Semitic as well, which is very ironic. So he, one of the things was he called China like an ossified society that would like never change, basically. And ironically, the generation after, China produced the most explosive change, and it happened in the span of a few months. And basically, there was all the dynastic rule came to an end in 1911, in the first revolution that made China into a republic. And it was so fast that Sun Yat-sen, who actually who some consider to be the father of the Republic of China, like he was teaching in Japan in exile or something, and to like rush him back to lead the troops and stuff like that. So, that's one thing I would say. Like, don't underestimate the Chinese people's potential for change and explosive change. China probably oversaw something that no one predicted. Very few people predicted. When Marx was calling the Taiping Revolution like backwards and all this other stuff, like, well, within 50 years, like the Chinese people in the span of a few months were able to get rid of thousands of years of imperial rule, and in a fairly peaceful revolution, actually. Like, I mean, there was blood and everything like that. There were warlords, but it was like a pretty impressive feat.
Let's talk Bitcoin security. I mean, the first thing you have to do, like this is the best practices stuff, right? You have to take your coins off an exchange. Everyone knows that. You have to take custody of your own Bitcoins. Well, that means holding your own private keys. The easiest way to do that is to get a hardware wallet so you can keep your coins offline. And we recommend this little thingy. It's called a Bitbox. You go to bitbox.swiss and use code Infinity for 5% off this thing. It's our favorite hardware wallet. It's very easy to use. It's good on privacy, and it's good for all kinds of other reasons too. And another thing that every Bitcoiner should do is write down their seed phrase. So usually when you fire up a hardware wallet, you get a seed phrase, 12 or 24 words that do not only represent your Bitcoin, they actually are your Bitcoin, these words. The 12 magic words are actually magic. And you could use a pen But I don't advise people to ever use a pen, because if you use pen and paper and your house burns down or something, that paper is gone forever. For that reason, this thing has been invented many times by many companies. It's a metal seed plate. And this one is from our favorite seed plate manufacturer, Stamp Seed. You get this beautiful hammer and you can stamp your seed into this metal plate. And this particular one, you can do your own design. Here on the backside, this has no design on it, but there's a beautiful everything divided seed plate that you can get. If you use code Infinity, you get 15% off everything on their store. So stampseed.com, go there and figure out more. And if you want to buy what we call a shit ton of Bitcoin, you should probably secure them in a multi-sig solution of some kind that have like more professional custody. And for that, we recommend the bitcoinadvisor.com. This is a bunch of happy Australian people that are more than willing to help you and handhold you into Bitcoin multi-sig custody. One key is held by you, one by them, and one by a third party. And you need 2 out of the 3 keys to unlock your Bitcoin. This is for Bitcoin inheritance and for people who want to buy, a shit ton of Bitcoin. So secure your Bitcoin. Go to Stampseed, go to Bitbox, go to the Bitcoin Advisor, and brush your teeth. Yeah, this is very positive because I think people underestimate how damn big this thing is. Like, what is like 1.44 billion people is the official number, right? I guess that number comes from the government, so it might be slightly inflated. But if it's true, that means there are 144 Chinese people per Swede, like probably 200 per Finn in the world, which makes it so vast and so big. And that must mean, like, if you have a normal bell curve distribution of brains, you have 144 times more geniuses in China than in Sweden. And this is just from statistics. And even if China's internet is very shielded from the rest of the world, it's still 1.5 billion people. That's huge. It's like so if and even with somewhat suppressed and censored freedom of speech there, like if these people just talk to one another long enough, they will start to break free from their shackles. There's like I happen to be an optimist, and I think these powers are just as they're rarely mentioned, especially by these doom porn black pill salesmen, FUD salesmen, as I call them, which are popular on the internet too. But the internet is first and foremost a force for good because it makes people talk and makes people have conversations like this one. And this stuff like this must happen all over China all the time, regardless of what the government thinks of it, right? Am I right about that, or what do you think?
Yeah. Well, you also asked before, like how, and we'll finally get to Bitcoin at minute. You know, I have a lot of hope because I've navigated the Chinese internet, and there are a lot of different pockets that give me a lot of hope. First, there are some cypherpunks in China, which is really, really cool to see. And there are also Bitcoin-only cypherpunks, which is also really cool to see. So people who are embracing encryption and who are actually building tools to help, defray against the state's power. So that certainly exists. I've written about it a few times, but there's a few Chinese people who post on Nostr. There was like kind of like a boost at a certain period of time. Like some of them have kind of tailed off, but people still post stuff on Nostr, and there's a lot of Bitcoin technical resources and things like that get translated into Mandarin. So that's very much alive. And one thing, before I get into the specifics of Bitcoin, I kind of want to share like a couple of stories that give me hope. Like one is, I was talking to someone who they were telling me like, hey, like, ever since I've actually learned more about Bitcoin, not only have I decided like maybe the digital yuan is like a terrible idea, but also I deleted my WeChat Pay and my Alipay because I see them as like parts of like, state control and stuff like that. And you see these stories where, I had another story I had, this is less Bitcoin related, but I went to a Tiananmen Square event where there were a lot of the Tiananmen Square leaders at the time. And, this one woman who was a student who was attending Harvard at the time, they came up and actually went to the panel speakers and they were like, oh, I had no idea this happened. And this makes me rethink like what happened with the government. And this makes me rethink my perception of the government and everything like that. So there's certainly these stories that are like cracks in the veil. And what I would say about the Chinese internet is actually that it's very alive and dynamic. I know that, and we can talk about the specifics of like how censorship happens and things like that. And don't get me wrong, people get arrested for saying things, and sometimes it's like really ridiculous. Like you had people get arrested for like tweeting "Glory to Hong Kong" for like 150 people, right? Like that. It's like I in talking with a few friends about it, what we find kind of scary about the Chinese security state, it's like a little bit random. They almost like chaos monkey. It's almost the opposite of what I described to you of like, if you're small enough, they leave you alone if you're a physical business. But if you're online and you're talking shop and they're like, you can be really small and they will go after you. So that's kind of a little bit weird to me. Whereas I think like other governments are a little bit more like, oh, well, let's wait until this person has like more influence and reach or whatever. Like the Chinese state has gone after really small people to like make examples, I think. But having said that, even though there are a lot of dramatic consequences, and maybe because there are dramatic consequences, the Chinese internet's like very alive and very sarcastic and very ironic. And, and you see people who are like subverting the party like all the time on there for like different things. Like, so for example, like, I'll give you an example. Like there's a sensitive date. So Mao Zedong's eldest son died supposedly because he was cooking like egg fried rice, like, and then the Americans bombed the site. They found it. I mean, who knows which story is true or not true, but there is a date where you're not supposed to talk about egg fried rice. And then everybody just talks about egg fried rice. So it's like, like there's a lot of that kind of level of stuff. So the Chinese internet's like a lot more alive than people realize. Like Chinese people are not, like to your earlier point, like, I mean, just based off the distribution of people, the Chinese people aren't dumb. Like there are a lot of really smart Chinese people, and yeah, they have consequences attached to their online identities and actions. But some of them, choose to build, I mean, it's not that many of them, but some of them choose to use privacy and build privacy tools. I mean, one thing about the Chinese internet that's really interesting about the censorship and that makes it more alive is that a lot more people are used to VPNs simply because you need to use the VPN to access stuff. Versus here in the West, it's kind of a little bit more like you use VPNs because you're kind of like, about cybersecurity. That's like a much smaller amount of people.
Yeah, right? We're not forced to use it. We use it to be the too cool for school, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, it's not necessary. But in China, it's like if you don't have it, there goes your access to like everything, right? And they have gotten more and more strict about banning things. Like one of the latest things is they banned LinkedIn, which I found really interesting because I was like, I don't really know how. Like it's become really hard to communicate with people in China. Because they ban like basically all the ways of doing that other than like WeChat or like everything else.
You mentioned sarcasm. I've heard somewhere that there are like code words for all of this stuff. So I guess there's a code word for the date where you can't talk about egg fried rice, whatever they call that. And like code words for Winnie the Pooh, which you of course can't mention. Yeah. Oh, I said it. Damn. I mean, we'll have to cut that out.
Well, that's if you all plan to go to China, which I don't know if having me on the show is a great.
Okay. Did I say Winnie the Pooh? I meant Mickey Mouse. No, I meant something else.
Yeah. No, there are like code words, and there's like, like you kind of like, to give you a really, like, this is probably like the most like popular or dramatic example is they censor any variant of the Tiananmen Square dates. It's June 4th, right? So they'll censor that date. So people on the Chinese internet started calling it May 35th and then like all these other things. And there's different ways to refer to it. And then, but sometimes some of it's gotten so ridiculous that like, for example, you can get arrested for like posting nothing. Like you can post like a black square and they're just like, oh, well, on this date, so it is a little dramatic.
But people haven't forgotten Tiananmen Square. I assume like, because that is I remember that even more clearly than when the wall came down. It's like as a moment of triumph for freedom, even if it wasn't a moment of triumph, it was very, very iconic. Like, so how do people see that in China now?
Well, I mean, it's hard to get like 100%. So I'll tell a little bit like some of the stories that I have about that, and then we can talk about how Bitcoin actually benefits. But
sorry for not getting into Bitcoin yet, but this is too interesting.
We're refusing to do that. We're trying to last a minute 65 without actually talking about Bitcoin once. I actually used to host Clubhouse rooms on like Tiananmen Square. So we actually had someone who was there talk about like his experience. And the Tiananmen Square kind of censorship is very, very heavy. And there are movements like the Tiananmen Mothers. So, for example, the Tiananmen Mothers were moms who had lost their children during Tiananmen Square. And they are basically placed under house arrest during the dates. Now you've seen that the Tiananmen Square commemorations the bans have extended into Hong Kong. So as soon as the CCP takes over like an area, there used to be these pretty big rallies in Victoria Park, but they've started arresting the organizers of that every time the date rolls by. And so, yeah, what I would say is there's been efforts in the diaspora. I think among the diaspora, it's still remembered, like there are still physical commemorations. So if you go to any of your local Chinese consulates or embassies during that date, you will more than likely see like at least 300, 400 people, kind of post up, and they have their signs. And that's been augmented actually recently, because one thing that's happened is I think Hong Kongers, or the Hong Kong young people who protested, a lot of them are now in exile. And they've actually, this is actually quite interesting, because in the past, what I've heard from some Hong Kong protesters is like, they didn't really see Tiananmen Square as like part of their struggle, or they didn't really, but the Hong Kong protesters now kind of see that whole movement, and there's been a little bit of a linking of that. So that's injected some young energy. So if you go to like these physical commemorations I'm talking about, you'll see some young people because of that. But generally speaking, the people who are of that Tiananmen generation are getting older. And there are museums that are being built. There's one that was built in Los Angeles. They actually raised funds through Coinbase. Some of the Tiananmen Square leaders are into cryptocurrency. I mean, I tried to get one of them to accept donations on Lightning, but he was like a little bit like, it's cool, man. So I tried to connect them to some of but it is what it is. It's a slow burn. But they actually raised funds through Coinbase for their museum. So they were certainly open to at least like crypto in general, right? And one of them in particular is actually Zhou Fensuo. He was like number 5 most wanted. So we used to talk during the Clubhouse days and stuff, and he's like super into crypto at the time. So there's some connections there. But but they are getting older. And so the older they get, I mean, the more, none of the significant ones have like passed away yet, because I think they're still like in their 60s kind of. But, there's a feeling that the conventional democracy movement from mainland China, like those people have been either exiled for like so long. At this point, it's like 30 or 40 years, right? That like, their connection to the actual Chinese people, it's kind of hard to see. I do think that there are anybody who comes out from the mainland to China, to like anywhere outside of China these days has, I think, a working understanding of Tiananmen. And one of the things that the Chinese state has been trying to do is kind of like almost soft reveal it, because they know like if you're outside of the country, you can look up information and all this if you want to. And I've talked with some members that there's obviously stories like the one I told you where people did not know at all, right? But among some of the people who have moved out, I think they are aware. But one thing I will say that gives me a little bit of pessimism is like the younger generation in China is very nationalistic in ways that is hard to really grasp until you like really confront it. They really believe that like China is this growing power that like is being held down by the United States. I think that's not 100% inaccurate, but at the same time, like I think they take that to like an extreme of extreme pride and like, in the nation, stuff like that. And obviously I'm not saying everyone is like that, but there are quite a few people who are very, very, very nationalist, especially the younger generation. I have this story. I was talking to someone who was a professor in China, and they were saying that when Pelosi was flying to Taiwan, their students were saying like, why aren't we shooting that? Like, why aren't we shooting her plane down? It's like super. Yeah. And there have been like anti-Japan protests, and some of you might have heard of like, stabbings of Japanese people in China and stuff like that. Like there is a very like nationalistic sentiment, and it is quite, I think, ugly in many respects. And I think that with this younger generation, they're more inclined to like, if you were to tell them about Tiananmen, they'd be like, so what? Like they're more inclined to be like, yeah, that's just like what we had to do. like as a country
So
to like be where we are right now.
So this nationalism, I guess that's connected to the racism, which is also quite prevalent in China, as I understand it, like especially against Africans and stuff. Do you think that's connected to like this narrative that the Communist Party has been spreading for so long, that this is that China is better than everywhere else, and this is the only system that works, and blah blah blah. And is the racism a product of that, or was that there before? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's it's an ethno-nationalism, right? And within that, there's a little bit of a conflict because China has a lot of ethnic groups. It's not just the Han majority, and so that's a struggle that we see in Xinjiang, we see with the Uyghurs, we see with Tibetans, right? And so that's like a big conflict in of itself. And one of the things, I mean, harking back a little bit, you were asking me like, if the party falls apart. I think what the party's really worried about is they will have taken a lot of lessons from the Soviet Union. I think what they're trying to prevent is when the Soviet Union fractured, there was a lot of ethnic strife. Same thing with Yugoslavia. Like basically the different countries and groups started killing each other. And in China, that there is enough ethnic diversity within. There is a kind of like Han chauvinism. So Han Chinese, of which I am a part, are the majority group. They're probably the most populous ethnic group in the world, I'm guessing, because Chinese people in the diaspora are the largest group, and they are the largest group within China. And so there are other ethnic groups within that there's kind of like this favoritism to the Han majority that also plays out. And then there's some, especially recently, a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment. I think partially because Japan is always aligned with the States after World War II, but also because of, the old grievances of, which I think some of them are legitimate. Like obviously there were Japanese war crimes committed during World War II against Chinese people and everything related to that. And that's being packaged into, I think at the beginning, 10 years ago, it was about burning Japanese cars, but now you're seeing like, there's like stabbings of Japanese people and things like that in China. So definitely seems to have progressed. And you mentioned specifically like racism against Africans. I mean, this is, do with this what you will, but I've been in China and I've seen Chinese people at their like one thing I will say is there's a lot of like, I hate to say this, but like, there's like a lot of white people who go to China and they're suddenly like huge experts on China because they're like, oh, like,
yeah.
Like,
all the information I have is from social media. So like take it with a grain of salt.
No, I'm not saying you. I'm saying like specifically there are some people who go and like the thing I almost want to tell them is like Chinese people act differently around you. They think you're one of them or not one of them. And I've seen Chinese people at like the most like blunt, like the most blunt possible. Like looking at the TV and being like, why are there monkeys? Why are there so many monkeys on they're talking about black people? Right? Like,
yeah,
like that is a very real thing. And yeah, I think that's been around for a while. Like one of the things that's always been really ironic to me is that a lot of people in China are very, even though they're being taught to hate the West in some ways, like they've embraced a lot of Western brands and specifically like they like, I think this is also an Asian phenomenon, like whitening their skin. Like it's actually I'm a fairly tanned individual and that has actually made me suffer in the Chinese community to a certain extent. Like people comment on that. They're like, oh, your skin tone's like very, very dark. And I'm like, like, so it's not just, I mean, I think that cultural part has been around. I think the Chinese state is actually trying to I think the Chinese state struggles with this because they're trying to tame it a little bit. Like to me, it's a little bit like, like how Trump and the state, I'm just going to use him as an example. Like he has some people on social that he probably doesn't want to be associated with, right? Like they're doing so much crazy stuff. I think the Chinese government's kind of similar. Like they want to perpetuate this sentiment of like, we're a strong nation and we have to fight against, the West and their cronies and lackeys. But I think some people, actually the Chinese state would probably prefer that some young people didn't take that as far. Like they've gone against even like Chinese mainstream authors and stuff like Mo Yan, who's like the head of the Chinese Writers Association. Like they've attacked these figures in the party for being like not inflammatory enough, right? Like I was just talking about like these students who are like talking about shooting down Pelosi's plane, like absolutely crazy conclusions, just like, and it's like when you ask them about like China and war, it's like a con game or something. They're like, yeah, like we'll beat the Taiwanese. Like we'll, like we'll just send a bunch of drones and just, it's a very odd kind of thing. And I don't want to be too loose with this comparison, but I suspect that, Japan, Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany went through like similar transformations in outlook, like in order to prime their citizens for war. And actually specifically Imperial Japan, I think, like went through a very similar thing. But I always find it really ironic because, and I've written about this, like in China, there are so many anti-Japan propaganda films from, like the old grievances, right? So one of the ones that got popular in Western studies, I don't know if you guys know Ip Man. The whole context was like, he was like taken prisoner of war by the Japanese, but he was such a good kung fu fighter, or not kung fu, whatever that style is. Anyways, the martial arts, that he could like beat all the Japanese, even though they had rifles, and that was kind of its own thing. But, there's also all these films about, and increasingly there's a lot of things about the Korean War, because that was the last time the Chinese fought the Americans. Right. And so there's this idea of like, okay, well, we're rallying people around fighting wars. I think it's probably pretty similar to how people were primed to fight wars, in the past. And I've always, that's like the darkest side to me, is like, if you get into the internet, Chinese internet, and some corners of it, and you talk with some people, and especially younger people, they have some like crazy conclusions. Like war is like a game to them, kind of. And I don't think that bodes well to have many people thinking like that.
It's nasty. It's nasty as hell. And now we haven't even mentioned the hypocrisy of the media corporations from the West that like play into these narratives and like make them even stronger by censoring stuff and making movies specifically for the Chinese audience and stuff like. Hello there. I'm Knut Svanholm, and I'm an international village idiot and author. These are my books on Bitcoin. Bitcoin sovereignty through mathematics, Bitcoin independence reimagined, Bitcoin everything divided by 21 million, and Bitcoin the inverse of clown world. These are now re-edited, redesigned, and available from the Bitcoin Infinity Store. I mean, look at that. Look at how your collection could look. It's upside down, but there they are anyway. But more than that, all of these books will be released for free, chapter by chapter, week by week on Noster. Also accompanied by a video that Luke and I will make talking about the ideas in the book, where we answer your questions, because you can sign up for the Bitcoin Infinity Academy and join courses for each and every one of the books and talk to us every now and then and get other perks, like a free set of steak knives. So go to the Bitcoin Infinity Store right now, get the books, sign up for the Academy.
The steak knives is only a maybe.
Oh, all right then. Let's get into the Bitcoin side of stuff, shall we? Like, we're close to the hour now. So yeah, what are your views on Bitcoin? Like, where do you want to start?
Well, I guess let's start with, you had asked me a question initially about like, how you see Bitcoin playing with China, right? Like in terms of that. And, I mean, one thing is that China is a very tightly, like we mentioned this like dramatic contrast between markets and party control, right? And where I think that plays out very, very directly, in many cases, sorry, I'm just going to close something right quick, is that, in China, you have the right to earn money in many ways. Like, I mean, that's been something that's fairly new, as we discussed in the 80s and 90s, but, within certain limits, but quite generous limits, you can make a ton of money in China, right? There's been a generation of people that have made a lot of money selling, as we mentioned, trash or widgets or whatever it is. But once have that money, you're not allowed to spend it or circulate it in ways the party does not want you to do. So in many ways, it's kind of like, the dystopia that Bitcoiners are always talking about. Like China's pretty close to that. Like you're basically forced to bank with the domestic system.
The CBDC is already there, like the social credit score system and all of that. It's the CBDCs, right?
Yeah. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but it's not even just about the CBDCs. Like even the default system in China is like in order to access WeChat Pay, you basically need a domestic banking account, right? So There's capital controls. So if you earn a ton of money, it's very hard for you to get money outside the system. That's deliberate. So there's a 50,000 USD per person per year limit on how much foreign currency you can buy. And this in many ways shapes a lot of the global economy actually in weird ways. Like, so for example, real estate markets and tourism and everything related to that. But this is a very fundamental block. What I'm trying to really say here is that Chinese people have the freedom to earn a ton of money, and they have, but they have they have many strict restrictions placed on them. China at one point was the country with the most capital controls in the world, right? And so how do they spend or circulate or invest that money? And you're seeing that play out right now in China because, for example, if there's a gold ETF or anything like that, like anything with positive return, people are piling into that. So one of my favorite questions to ask people who are, in mainland China, I'm just like, how are your share portfolios doing? How's your real estate doing? And they'll give me answers back like, I'm 30% down. I'm 60% down. I'm like, wow, that's like Great Depression levels, right? So, Bitcoin as a hedge against that is a very, very strong, argument. I think what we've seen in like kind of the quantitative stats is that Chinese people are buying more and more Bitcoin, despite the fact that there are restrictions on exchanges. So there is no public trading pair between the yuan and Bitcoin because as an exchange, you are banned from, offering Bitcoin for Chinese yuan. And so really the trade happens through like these informal OTC desks and through exchanges. Some Western journalists have written about like P2P and like laundromats and stuff like that. Like, I don't really know how much that happens. Like, I know there's some like old OGs that have like different social media groups. But most of the buying happens through basically the old Chinese exchanges, Huobi, Binance, and like all these others. They have like kind of like OTC merchants that are willing to take the risk. So what happens is they pay a escrow to be listed. Like, let's just use Binance as an example. So Binance will have a page that just has like these merchants, these OTC merchants, and those OTC merchants are willing to send you, they pay a fee to get listed in Binance, but they're not Binance. And this is very important because if they were Binance, the Chinese government would go after Binance. But instead, the Chinese government will only really go after any of these OTC merchants who could be like anybody. I don't really know who, right? And so the OTC merchants charge whatever spread. The spread is a little bit higher on Bitcoin than it is on Tether. So what we've actually seen is a lot of Chinese people buying Tether, but there are some merchants that do sell Bitcoin. I think that overall, though, Bitcoin can immediately help a lot of Chinese people by just escaping that system, right? Like what we described, because they're getting pounded in terms of return. Like they're making negative return, like negative nominal and negative real, and like really significant negative return because of how badly the Chinese economy is doing. Even to get out, I think the mental block with Chinese people, from what I've observed, is that there's very few Bitcoin maxis. There are some. I'm in touch with some of them. And the ones who are Bitcoin maxis, super based. I think the big mental block is most Chinese people are still thinking in terms of US dollars.
Yeah. So, and also, from what I heard, this is a Westerner, listening to too many rumors, but the Chinese are happy gamblers, like really addicted.
Yeah,
there's a lot of gambling addicts, and that's why shitcoins are so popular. Like you like the gamble factor. Like is there a truth to that?
Well, I mean, I play poker every Sunday at no.
Yeah.
Actually, poker's probably the least DJ.
Like,
well, poker and ping pong. Yeah, catch me at adopting Bitcoin next time. We'll do both. No, yeah. So the rumors are correct. I wish you could both understand Mandarin because they actually run these like X rooms where they live stream the picks that they're making, and they're talking about Mandarin, and it's so fucking hilarious because people will come in and they'll be like, and they like almost like the one I was in, I was just like, this is so hilarious. Like people would come in and just be like, this was my pick of the day. Like, look at this token. But what was so funny was they would actually come in and they would get respect for which scams they were taken by. Like one guy would come in and be like, oh, I lost so much money on Plus token. And they're like, oh, wow, this guy's like an OG. Like he was losing money in like 2018. Like what? Like, Yeah, there's a lot of degeneracy. And the tether kind of plays into that a little bit, because basically what happens is they buy like lower spreads with tether, and then they use the tether to trade pairs. And then they actually go to like lower and lower exchanges, because there's like, apparently, I don't really know all this too much, but like apparently there's tokens and things that even Binance refuses to list, or Huobi or whatever. Yeah, I just don't know what that line would be, because like, but yeah, like people will go all the way down, and there's a lot of degeneracy, and that is part of the problem. I mean, if any of you go to Asia or any of the Asian Bitcoin conferences, sad to say this, but that mentality does infect there.
Yeah. So there's not a lot of maxis. So the follow-up question to that, is there any conversation about Austrian economics? Like if for instance, if you're allowed to earn as much money as you want, but you're not allowed to use it for whatever you want, I would instantly like argue that is not money. It's just a fancy gift card from your captor, and you're suffering from Stockholm syndrome. Like, are people thinking that along those lines at all? Like, is that conversation going on, that government money isn't money really? Like this WeChat thing is just a tool for control. Like, do people see that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting places has been Hong Kong. Hong Kong was actually like a free port city, and like had multiple like. So one guy I actually had an interview with was Simon Lee, really interesting guy, because he built like a think tank that was dedicated to like libertarian economics, like in Hong Kong. But
no, Hong Kong is a great example of how powerful free markets are. It's like one of the most shining examples in the world.
Yeah, and unfortunately, what happened was, and this has happened to a lot of, because I used to know quite a few Bitcoiners who lived in Hong Kong, and they've all left, unfortunately, because like there was a lot of benefits. Of course, there was 0% tax, and there was a lot of it was a free port, as we just discussed, and there was a lot of markets, and it was a good way to invest, and it was a bridge between West and East, right? It was kind of like the CCP kind of used that as kind of like a bridge between financial flows from the West into into China. But I think the CCP realized that they couldn't maintain political control over that because of the protests. And so they stepped in and they kind of rewrote the whole governing documents, and implemented a national security law. It was very draconian. And so, yeah, Hong Kong has slowly drifted away. There are, so I will say that Bitcoiners that do become Bitcoiners in China, I see them as like the roses that grow out of concrete, right? Like you have to really, so they tend to be like, for lack of a better word, like very based. Yeah, because because like in order to be who they are, it's actually pretty dangerous to like have even that level of view, right? It's like government money should, like it's very anti what the Chinese government thinks. I don't know if you remember that broadcast with this Chinese government, one of the economists, I think he was working with the Chinese government or something. He's just like, if we adopt Bitcoin, like literally everyone will die. Like, I don't know if you see that.
Yeah, I saw that. It's like I have never seen a more Keynesian. If like, I've never seen a person fall for the false narrative of inflation is necessary, otherwise people will die, than that guy. Like, it was hilarious.
Yeah. And now China has, well, according to its stats, which again, going back to the elephant, we don't really know, but has deflation. Regardless, like with that, if you're, it's almost like I think it was Camus that said it, like live your life so that like your very existence is like an act of freedom. Like I see that in
based quote.
Yeah. Camus. I see that in quite a few Chinese Bitcoiners or dissidents, right? Like they are living in a context where like it is pretty dangerous to have those views and to practice the things. Like I actually saw, not to snitch or anything, but I saw a few people using Nostr to zap each other who are probably Chinese, like in the mainland. And I was thinking about how like that's probably illegal.
Yeah, but but it is changing the world from the inside. It's beautiful. Like, maybe that's the way to go. Maybe that you don't have to become a Tiananmen Square guy with the shopping bags. You can be anonymous Noster VPN person instead, and just live your life.
Yeah, that's what I've been trying to tell people too, is that Bitcoin is a really unique thing because it's like kind of like HTTPS. Because a lot of people who come to my events, they're like Monero people. They're always like, why is Monero not overthrowing the Chinese state or stuff like that? And I'm like, well, it's because no one uses or buys Monero. But the thing is like, and the reason why is because Monero has like no return profile. It's like obviously branded to be, but Bitcoin is like, you need some normies to be using it. Because then otherwise you're just like literally like, you're just bait. Like, I mean, if you use Monero, you're just using Monero, right? Like it's like that Anero chat. It's like that like line of phone numbers that was only sold to criminals and then the state took it over. I'm like, well, you can't. You need like the legitimate use of Bitcoin is like, it's a store of value that is much better. It's a much better money, right? In different ways, in a way that Monero is not. And so I think with that, that's what I've been trying to tell people. Like when I went to Hong Kong, I had this super simplistic narrative in my head that I was going to find people who are like, I'm using Bitcoin because, fuck the Chinese state, and like blah, blah, blah. But they were using the US dollar for that, actually. So there was a lot of like Cantonese forums. They were like, we want to divest from Hong Kong. We're going to buy US dollars. So again, just talking back, I think there's a mental block where it's like it's like the allegory of the cave. And you're at the bottom level of the cave where you're like, digital yen is good. And then you go up one level and you're like, US dollar is good. And then you go up like another level. But very few people have made that leap to the next level. Although one thing I will say is in China, it's hard to tell because there are people who are kind of like like you do have a silent, because people will not talk about this, right? Like they're like, even buying Bitcoin is technically kind of illegal. So like, they're not going to talk about it openly.
Yeah. This is my experience with dictatorships in general. Like when I was on Cuba, it was the same thing. Like no one said anything bad about the government. Like they didn't dare to.
No one will say anything to it, especially to an outsider, bad about the government, because they're like, well, we don't know what you're going to do with that. So, but you see it in the action. So I actually, I have an article that's going up in a bit that talks about it, but I interviewed the chain analysis team because they have relationships with previous OTC desks. Not a huge fan of what they do otherwise, but they trace like the amount of OTC flows that come in through China. And that's just been increasing as we discussed. And so even though, obviously there's not like conferences in China, and there is two Mandarin Chinese Bitcoin podcasts though. Tom and Jerry Discover Bitcoin, and there's another one that's more technical. I forget the name. But there are a few developers. Like China, they don't actually bother the developers, or they haven't bothered developers so far. So there are some developers who live in China who work on parts of Bitcoin, just randomly saying that. But
Tom and Jerry?
Yeah, so it's like Tom and Jerry 发现 B2B, which means Tom and Jerry discover Bitcoin. Yeah. So there's two kind of Mandarin language podcasts on Bitcoin, but the Tom and Jerry one is based in Malaysia, or at least the hosts are. But they mostly interview mainland Chinese people because they do it in Mandarin. And the other one I think is actually based in mainland China. I forget what it's called, but there are some podcasts and materials on there. But I think the thing with that though is like you need there to be a broad enough ecosystem. So with Hong Kong, I came in, I was like, okay, where's it's like, are they revolting with Bitcoin, et cetera? And it's not quite as simple as that. But what I've been telling people is like, Chinese people choosing to put their money outside the Chinese system is revolution. It actually is the most, it's not even like, you don't wake up and just be like, I'm a revolutionary. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's very few people who are like that. There's maybe like, I don't know, 5% of the population that's just like, I actively am trying to be a rebel. I think like 95 or 90, I don't know how many percent. This is just maybe I'm a pessimist about this, but like many people are just trying to be like, I just want to live my life day to day. Like if the government doesn't get in my way, I won't get in the way of the government, that kind of thing.
That's a normie. Like in any country, that's what most people do.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, in China, what's really interesting is that normies are confronted with like really draconian restrictions that actually affect their lives. Like we talked about the VPN example, but the Bitcoin example is a really good example because if you're in China, you're not allowed to invest really any significant amount of money outside of China. So that means you only really have access to Chinese shares, which have been tanking, Chinese real estate, which has been tanking, Chinese government bonds, which are kind of in a bubble, and like a gold ETF comes and gets lifted, and like they had to delist it because there was so much demand for it, right? So, that almost is like the revolution per se. It's like the backdoor revolution, but that is actually like, it's just the incentives. You're not like encouraging people to revolt or rebel. You're just pointing out that like, this is a tool for you to get out of the system. And it is the thing, and I point out in my book, that is the thing the Chinese Communist Party fears most, because their whole system is based on the state controlling markets, right? If the Chinese people are able to actually flow their capital outside the system, that's actually the most threatening thing there that can happen. And, in Hong Kong, the interesting thing, because people ask me all the time, they're like, why is Hong Kong trying to be a Web3 hub and all this other stuff? And I'm like, well, it's because, I mean, I have my own opinions about it. But the reason why they're doing that is because they're losing capital inflow. Like the Chinese state is losing access to foreign capital. And that's become like an existential problem for them and the Chinese model.
There's a lot to take in here. I mean, Roger, this has been super fascinating. I'd love to learn more about China. We are going to see each other in Prague, where your book will probably be available from our booth, actually. Before we wrap this thing up, is there anything we haven't, any subject we haven't touched you want to mention? Like, did we miss anything?
I just wanted to mention briefly that I'm working on a second book, which has nothing to do with China and Bitcoin.
Oh, fantastic. Do you have a working title?
It's not a good one though. I'm like really bad at that. So maybe you all can help me with this, but the working subtitle is like, how not to get fucked by AI to own the future, or how not to get owned by AI. Yeah. So, I mean, generally the idea is to try to, what I notice is there's a lot of anxiety about like AI or whatever, like just, is AI coming to eat us, take our jobs, etc., take our women? Trying to use that as an anchoring point for people to understand more deeply why their choices of technologies and, what they use is so important. So Bitcoin, Nostr, freedom tech in general, encryption, why these things really matter.
Yeah, super cool. I mean, a lot of, like we mentioned before, doom porn and black pill FUD salesmen, that they are loud. So don't be afraid of AI. Real stupidity beats artificial intelligence every time. And anywhere you want to send our listeners on the internet, anything you want them to do, a call to action of some kind?
I mean, if they want like more, I know we've had like a really in-depth conversation. I really appreciate it. If they want more of the same, I have a website, ChinaBitcoinBook.com, which just has more of like my reporting and stuff like that. I've been trying to send people to my Nostr, but like people have been telling me my Nippo 5 hasn't been working as well. So, I mean, I'm low-key at Nostr-verified.com, but if you can't find me, just like look up my name. I think on Nostr you should be able to find me. I do have at Roger H1991 on X if you want to follow me on there. But recently I've just decided I'm only going to post memes there. I'm like not like I'm only going to repost and post memes. So less, I don't know. It depends on what flavor of me that you want to access.
All right. Well, thank you very much anyway. Great conversation. Great to have you. Wish you all the best. And this has been the Bitcoin Infinity Show and nothing else. Thanks for listening.
I appreciate it.